The LEED program does not require bird-friendly glass, but it should, in my opinion. Think about it. It's kind of sad that a building can be awarded a gold or platinum status, and be this monolith of a glass tower that kills tons of birds.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast,
a show where we, Paul Shapiro and Toni Okamoto,
spotlight companies making money by helping solve some of the world's most pressing problems. Welcome back to the show. We hope you found the first episode with John Mackey useful. We certainly did. We're excited about this interview with Lisa Schon, since what she's doing could end up helping spare huge numbers of wildlife from meeting a painful and untimely end. Here's the interview, and of course, afterward, please let us know what you think at businessforgoodpodcast.com. Okay, seriously, admit it. Have you ever walked into a glass door? Chances are that yes, you or maybe someone you know has smashed face first into a wall of glass.
I've definitely seen you do this.
Okay, so maybe I've done it myself, but when humans make this mistake, we are likely only walking a couple miles an hour, so we can escape with little more than embarrassment.
You were definitely embarrassed.
Okay, maybe that's true too, but what if you're not a human walking at a couple miles an hour, but rather you're a bird flying at, let's say, 30 miles an hour? Your chances of escaping that collision aren't so good.
It turns out that a lot of birds never see the glass coming. In fact, estimates vary, but at least hundreds of millions and maybe even as many as 1 billion wild birds die in the U.S. annually just from flying into windows. That's more birds than are killed from oil spills and pesticides. It's more than are killed by hunters. But yet, what are we doing about it?
You rarely see wildlife advocates protesting window construction. It's almost as if we're primed to think that the carnage isn't so bad because there was no malintent. No one went out and purposefully killed 1 billion wild birds, yet the result is sadly the same. Our windows are among the biggest wildlife slaughterers on the planet.
Fortunately, we don't have to take out our windows or keep the blinds down all the time, since there are now companies like Arnold Glass that are making windows that birds can actually see. And we happen to have one of their leaders, Lisa Schon, here with us today. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. And I have to say I'm a huge podcast listener, and this is my first time ever being on a podcast. So thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about Ornilux, bird protection glass, and the collisions issue. It's very, very near and dear to my heart.
Very cool. Well, we are honored to be your first podcast interview, and no doubt it'll be a great one. So it's really great to be talking with you, Lisa. I know the places that I've worked, we've put up reflective stickers in windows. We've tried other ways to prevent bird collisions, but it didn't always work. In fact, some of the impromptu solutions people came up with often seem to negate the whole purpose of even having a window in the first place. So can you just start out by telling us a little bit about what you're up to at Arnold Glass and how you're trying to solve this problem with your product called Ornilux?
Sure. So just to clarify, it's not exactly correct that decals don't work. They're typically not effective because of how they are placed. Most folks just put up a few stickers and they call it a day. Decals would be effective if applied according to what's called the 2x4 rule, which is that a pattern on the glass must be spaced. So for instance, no greater than 2 inches horizontally or 4 inches vertically. The idea there being that, small birds might still think they can fly through that little narrow space because they are incredibly acrobatic flyers. And as you mentioned in your intro, they're very fast, which is why the collisions are so dangerous. But you're right that a visible pattern that dense ruins why people like glass. Transparency, views to the outside, people want to let natural light inside, things like that. So what's good about or what's better about Ornilux, I think, is not so much better for birds as it is maybe for people because of its transparency. So as I mentioned, to make a glass bird friendly, you need to have some kind of a pattern on it, breaking up the reflections of trees and sky that the birds are responding to. They respond to the reflections. And as you mentioned before, they can't read the architectural clues of like window frames or blinds or something like that we can, as you said, most of the time we can read them. Sometimes our brains go on the fritz and we hit glass too. But what's special about Ornilux is it creates this pattern using the principle of UV light, ultraviolet light, which most birds have the ability to see, and people do not see UV light. Our visual systems do not have the necessary equipment to pick up that frequency of light. So you end up with a patterned UV reflective glass type that is visible to birds and has a very high transparency for people. And one of the advocate people I've worked with over the years, she kind of calls it the holy grail of bird-friendly glass.
Thank you. So what was the inspiration behind Ornilux? How did you all come up with this idea?
I love this story. It's kind of always an interesting hook for people. It's pretty cool. So Ornilux is actually rooted in biomimicry design theory. It's a nature-inspired product. If you're not familiar, many of your listeners are, biomimicry is a design concept of learning from nature and then emulating nature's forms, processes, systems in order to create more sustainable designs. So Ornilux is actually inspired by spiders. And the quick and dirty version of the backstory is somewhere around the early 2000s, Arnold Glass chairman and Ornilux inventor Hans Joachim Arnold learned how spiders might use UV reflective materials in their webs as a way to not only attract prey or other things that it might serve them for, but that it could perhaps also alert birds to the presence of the webs so that the birds would avoid flying, crashing into them, and thus taking down the web and destroying the spider's ability to capture prey. Whether or not that's true or not has not necessarily been proven, but I think what was important about it was that became the inspiration in understanding and knowing about the window collisions problem, about an idea about a bird-friendly glass. So Mr. Arnold became very passionate about this idea of UV reflectance to create a transparent bird-friendly glass that would help to mitigate collisions, but also then have a high adoption rate for people because of maintaining its transparency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the idea behind it is essentially that birds don't fly into spider webs because the spider web has UV. So spiders evolved this capacity to produce UV in their webs, presumably to prevent birds from crashing in and destroying their web, right?
Well, okay, so I am not an insect specialist nor an avian specialist, but this was a research paper that was published and that the folks in Germany came across. So whether or not that's true, I think has sort of been debated back and forth in the spider world. I just called spiders insects. See, I'm not a spider person. I'm glad I caught that so we didn't get any hate mail. But anyway, I think what's important was not so much that was an evolution of a spider. It was sort of the research paper was positing, what potentially could be some of the advantages of spiders having UV reflective materials in their silk. And that was one idea. It was like, oh, well, they live in the same environment with birds and they need to have their webs visible and birds would probably be crashing through their webs. So it was sort of this aha moment of, oh, birds crashing into something, birds crash into spider webs, birds crash into glass, UV light, transparent, birds see it, people don't see it, aha. And that was kind of the connection.
That is so fascinating. So birds see it, but humans don't, right? So is it a special type of glass or is it regular glass that has like UV on it? Like tell us what's the actual thing that the birds are seeing.
So it's just regular glass. But the Ornilux part of it that makes it the sort of bird-friendly part is it's actually a coating. So similar to, if you're familiar with like low-E coatings. So they're manufactured in a similar process with a few extra steps for the Ornilux. So basically the coating is manufactured onto these jumbo panes of glass. This is in a big glass factory, which are then cut and fabricated into finished insulated glass units for windows, for example, or laminated units that folks might use for windscreens or guardrails, glass walls, that kind of thing. So everything about the glass is just normal glass fabrication, normal glass production, except for the patterned coating that gets put in onto the glass and then becomes the part that makes it bird-friendly.
Is the problem for birds more with office buildings or residential homes?
So we know from research experts that all glass is dangerous to birds. It doesn't matter if it's one pane in your house or a giant skyscraper, but it is a matter of scale if you think of it in one term. So in one way, more glass definitely equals more collisions. So a large commercial building with huge expanses of untreated glass has the potential to have many more collisions than a typical home which has smaller areas of glazing, smaller windows. But as you know, probably from your own experience in your own home, or you've heard from people or the research you've done, that home windows are also dangerous. It's really just a matter of scale. And I think that's one of the reasons why people don't realize what a big problem this is, because you have individual homeowners who say, yeah, well, maybe 2 or 3 birds a year might hit my windows. But if you multiply that by as many homes as there are, as much glass as there is, in the US, in the world, that's how we add up to those really astronomical, scary numbers.
And that's 2 or 3 birds hit. That doesn't mean that there aren't other birds you never heard or saw hit as well.
Exactly. They might, there might not have been a mark left, or something happens, when you're not around. Exactly. So those numbers are probably conservative, which is even more terrifying.
It's also a really traumatic experience to see a bird hit your window and try to figure out how you can help the bird, help revive the bird.
Exactly. I mean, I think another piece of that, why people don't think it's a big problem, is very often the birds will hit and not die instantly, but they have a very, serious, brain injury from their beak, pushing back through their skull or something like that, or they broke their neck or whatever. But they're creatures of prey. And so their natural instinct is to go hide somewhere. And a lot of people just think, oh, the bird's fine. It flew off, and they don't see it. So that's really a misconception. But it is very upsetting. I mean, I even solved my own thing. I have a very simple, expensive solution on my home windows called bird savers. They work great, but just this year, and I'm very excited about this personally, we have ordered new windows for our home, and they're going to be glazed with Ornilux. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah.
Cool.
So what % of windows in America are bird-friendly, and what's the cost compared to conventional bird-unfriendly glass?
The first part there, what percentage? I don't know that we have statistics on that. I know American Bird Conservancy, which is one of the leading organizations working on collisions, has been collecting data over the year from glass manufacturers to try and put together some numbers about that. But I don't know. I haven't seen any published or finished results from that yet. But you can bet that it's an extremely small. I don't even know if it would even register on a percentage scale. But we're, one building at a time. And then to the second part of your question, the cost comparison. So when I'm talking about cost, it's always good to know, who the audience is, so I can make it into something that's somewhat meaningful. So the way the glass industry and supply chain works, and the window company, it's not so easy to make a blanket statement about necessarily, specific costs. Arnold Glass produces only the glass units, which, have one price. But the majority of your audience, building owners, they sort of look at glass and receive it as part of like a window system, meaning glass plus frame. So I think one way that I think we can meaningfully talk about it here is, for sure, you should expect to pay more if you go for bird-friendly glass. Kind of like if you decided to go with a very high quality window framing system and super high energy efficient glazing systems, they're going to be more expensive. It's definitely a higher price point than a commodity Home Depot type run-of-the-mill low-E window. But for people that are interested and serious about looking into this and getting cost, my experience is that it's really best to make the decision for bird-friendly glass early in the budget phases of a project. Whether that's, you're going to get new windows, you want to replace some glass, or you're designing a new structure, whatever. Talk about it while you're still in planning stages when you're setting the budgets. Because it's definitely a tough sell if going bird friendly is sort of this nice to have afterthought, because it is significantly more expensive than standard low E glass.
So it costs more, but of course there's the added value of not killing birds. But still, how do we know, Lisa, that this glass is actually effective? Are there studies or tests that have been done that prove that there are fewer or no bird collisions when you use Ornilux or other bird-friendly glasses?
Yeah, so I also love that first part of your statement there, the value of there's no added value of not killing birds. And personally, I find it a real bummer that most people do not assign a monetary value for animal conservation. I mean, it's really kind of a bummer because, there is a monetary, personally, I believe there's a huge value in reducing avian mortality because, birds are a terribly important part of our ecosystem. And, maybe one day. So to your question about testing, first of all, I think it's important for people to know that there is no solution that completely reduces collisions. I mean, birds have been known to even fly into the sides of barns or, brick buildings, if they're terrified. So that's one thing. But what we do know with the testing, there is a formal testing process that is run by American Bird Conservancy, and they're kind of the leading organization in the US for collisions. And they operate a flight tunnel. It's a flight test tunnel at a bird banding station in Western Pennsylvania. And at this location, they independently test different glass types for effectiveness. So just for context, a banding station is where ornithologists study migrating birds. So they capture them in mist nets, and then the birds are counted and weighed, and what type of bird, and then after they record all that data they do for their studies, then the poor little birds, after their day hasn't been rough enough, they have to go through this test tunnel. So the basic protocol is the tunnel is a 30-foot long dark box with 2 panes of glass at one end, where the birds obviously try to escape towards light. So one of the panes is a clear control pane. Has no pattern on it, so it's not visible to the birds. And then the test pane would be right next to it. So for instance, that might be an Ornilux pane. So the birds are released at the far end of the tunnel, and then it's measured which flight path they take as the escape route. And if they avoid the test pane, that means that they saw the pattern, and so it gets recorded as an avoidance. Also, I always like to tell people there's a mist net in front of the glass that stops the birds from hitting the pane.
I was going to ask, actually, so that it's not a lethal experiment here.
Yeah, I actually watched a YouTube video about the process, and it was really interesting. And one thing that I liked that the video talked about was that every bird that it saves matters. Even if it's just one bird, your home windows are saving, that bird matters.
Yeah, exactly. Well put.
So, Lisa, what's been the reaction from environmental groups? I mean, are they campaigning to try to get Ornilux or other bird-friendly glasses installed? Has this become a rallying cry for environmentalists?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think I work a lot, obviously, and talk to a lot of people in the green building space. So also, architects and designers who are working in that environmental space. And they're always looking for the next thing. What is the next thing we need to be worried about? We've got people talk about energy and wind and water. And, now the collisions topic has really gained, in the last at least 8 years that I've been involved with, it's really grown in the awareness. So the folks that are working on the advocacy side, the environmental side of it, of course, they have had a very positive reaction to Ornilux. Just an example. So Ornilux has been available since 2006, but it was launched in Germany. But back in 2010, when I got involved and when Arnold Glass made the decision to bring Ornilux to the US, the advocacy groups were very excited because they recognized this sort of holy grail value of a transparent bird-friendly glass. And to be honest, nobody in the glass industry was paying attention. So these advocacy guys, American Bird Conservancy, Audubon, they were knocking on doors trying to, pulling at the coattails of the glass industry saying, come on, we need solutions. And they knew about Ornilux, but they hadn't been successful in catching their attention or getting, somebody to bring it here. So I kind of facilitated that. One thing you might be interested in is what's kind of going on around the country so that these advocacy groups have facilitated. There are efforts in many cities around North America to have mandatory or voluntary even bird-friendly building guidelines. And this kind of rolls out differently across the country or different cities. So we tend to see, just an example, on the mandatory side, which is really fantastic, there's San Francisco, Chicago area, Toronto. They have mandatory requirements for bird-friendly glass. And there's specifics around that you can, if you're interested to find out more.
But mandatory, you mean is it for homes, for office buildings, just for new construction? Do you know what the actual ordinances say?
Yeah, and they probably differ a little bit because, these efforts were pretty much led by city planning groups, groups of and teams with architects and advocates. And so they probably end up passing through city council what city council will approve. I'm most familiar with San Francisco, which I think also probably has one of the most comprehensive. And my understanding of that is It's for new construction, certain renovations. I don't believe that residential is required. I don't believe residential is mandatory, or like private residential, I think. And then there's certain situations that they define where glass needs to be treated. Just as an example, from grade up to the first, I think it's 60 feet, 30 or 60. I don't have them in front of me. If you face a green space, or if you face open water or a park, then a certain percentage of the glass has to be treated. So bird friendly.
And can it be done retroactively? Like if I have windows in my home that are already installed, can they be treated, or does it have to be done? Like, does a whole new window needs to be ordered?
Well, you would do a glass replacement.
Glass replacement.
So
okay.
yeah. So you've got your window frame. It would be easy if you decided to get all new windows, right? The window frame. When I say windows, I think there's a little semantic difference there, because when you say windows, I know you mean glass.
Yes,
and when I say windows,
sorry. No, my bad, Lisa. So I couldn't have Ornilux come and get sprayed onto the glass in my windows at my home.
Exactly.
Got it.
It requires, Ornilux is not for existing. There are solutions out there for, like film products and stuff, but Ornilux, unfortunately, is not one of them.
Hey, so what about LEED certification? You mentioned environmentally friendly building codes. So for folks who don't know, LEED is a certification program for buildings to prove that they are environmentally conscious. But does LEED require bird-friendly glass?
As far as I know, the LEED program does not require bird-friendly glass, but it should, in my opinion. Think about it. It's kind of sad that a building can be awarded a gold or platinum status, and be this monolith of a glass tower that kills tons of birds. That's ironic, but it is an indication that there's still more work to be done in creating awareness of this collisions issue and getting the word out there. But what does exist, there is something very positive. So U.S. Green Building Council several years ago launched what's called Pilot Credit 55, and it relates to bird collision deterrence. So architects or building owners can achieve what's called an innovation credit if they meet the requirements of the credit. So there's like a little calculation based on the amount of glazing and the different treatment that might be used. So there is something, and my experience too is that this really has been a positive thing. And I've had architects contact me where they weren't even thinking about bird-friendly glass, but then they saw this pilot credit and they said, oh, here's a chance where we can get another point. And they contacted me and said, what is it? How does it work? And how does it integrate? So that is a very important thing. So the mandatory and voluntary things going on around the cities, this thing with LEED, legislation that is happening around this are really, really important things, elements in working to create this change, this positive change towards a bird-friendly design.
You mentioned city ordinances. Is anything happening in Congress on this?
Yeah, so there's actually a bill, and there's a version in both the House and Senate pending discussion or voting or whatever it is those folks do. It's called the Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act. And to my knowledge, it's kind of been poking along over the years and it kind of gets pushed to the side and then pushed to the next year. So I don't really think that anything has happened there, but there was a bill only in the House, and then I believe it was last year, the Senate bill was launched. And what it would require is the General Services Administration would be required for all new federal buildings to incorporate bird-safe building materials and design features. So that could also be a big win.
Cool. We'll have to look that up, the Federal Bird Safe Building Act. All right, we'll check that out. So, Lisa, if there's anything the listeners who want to help wild birds can do, or any resources you want to point them toward, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think it's important to be educated about the issue, why it happens, how you can solve it, and learn about different ways that you can reduce collisions at your home or at your workplace. You could bring this up. Like I said, many people do not even know about this. They're totally unaware about it. So, even if at the office building you work at, talk to the facilities manager, say, hey, how many dead birds do you pick up? I know people who are bird conservationists who gather a small team together and they go to work early in the morning and they start counting dead bodies of birds. And they talk to the facilities managers and say, hey, can you help? Because a lot of times the facility managers are out there early in the morning. they clean up the carcasses and people don't see them. So, get the data to prove, to take the argument to, the building owner or your managers or whatever and say, we've got a problem. Let's do something to fix it. So, short, we talked about a glass replacement project, which I know is not always a feasible thing, especially maybe as a homeowner. But get educated about solutions that are out there for existing glass. We have a few links on the ornilux.com website on our birds and glass page, ornilux.com.
And finally, Lisa, we like to close out each episode with some gratitude. If you'd like to end the show with anything for which you're grateful, now's your chance.
Okay. Oh, I like that. I'm grateful for folks working on the advocacy side, whose efforts have done a great job to create awareness about this issue. And you guys I would include that in that bucket, because you're getting it out there with this podcast. And I really would like to give a shout out to Mr. Arnold for his dedication to and his tenacity in not only bringing to market, but also keeping to market this glass. He's been really steadfast in his commitment to it. And he's really coming from a space of, as a glass manufacturer, he's part of the problem and he has a responsibility to be a part of the solution. And I think him staying the course and those advocacy efforts have gotten it to the point where people's heads are really turning, not just on the owner side or the architect side, but also the glass industry. And that's a really big thing. There's definitely been some wonderful momentum over the last, 8 to 10 years. So I appreciate that.
Sure. We really appreciate that, Lisa. And that's a theme of this podcast. You talk about some people will see business as the problem, and sometimes that's the case, but business can also be the solution to so many of the problems that we as a society face. And in this particular case, having access to windows that actually solve this problem is a good example of a business for good. So we appreciate you taking time to chat with us, and we wish you the best of luck and the best of success in popularizing bird-friendly windows.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was good to talk to you.
There you have it, folks. Lisa Schon of Ornilux Bird Friendly Glass. Check out businessforgoodpodcast.com to let us know what you think and to see links about how you can make your windows less lethal to our feathered friends. Thanks so much for listening to the show.
We hope you got a lot out of it and that you will show us some love. You can rate Business for Good as 5 stars on iTunes, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends interested in business or really just in making the world a better place about the show.
And we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please feel free to contact us anytime via our website, businessforgoodpodcast.com.
And as always, we hope that you will be in the business of doing good.